Have you ever looked at the Titanic and thought, okay, but who even had that kind of money? Because let's be real, the Titanic wasn't just a ship. It was basically a floating kingdom, massive, luxurious, expensive in a way that almost doesn't even make sense. And that's what makes this story so crazy. The man most people connect to the Titanic wasn't some random dreamer who got lucky. He came from a world where shipping lines weren't just businesses, they were empires. And behind that empire, family money, ruthless competition, elite connections, and one of the richest financial networks on the planet. So the real question isn't just who built the Titanic, it's this: how do you get so powerful, so connected, and so absurdly wealthy that you can help bring a ship like the Titanic into existence? And honestly, once you really dig into it, the answer says a lot more about old money, business ambition, and ego than it does about ships. Because the Titanic was never just about crossing the ocean, it was about status, power, flexing on the entire world. And in my opinion, that's exactly why this story still hits so hard today. The Titanic wasn't born from simple necessity. It was born from wealth trying to prove a point. So stick with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to see that the money behind the Titanic didn't appear overnight. It came from inheritance, strategy, giant business deals, and the kind of elite world connections normal people could barely even imagine. And the wildest part, the same money and ambition that made the Titanic possible also helped create the mindset that made people believe a ship like that could never fail. First things first, was there really a founder of the Titanic? Before we go deeper, let's clear up something that gets mixed up all the time. A lot of people talk about the founder or creator of the Titanic, like it was just one guy sitting in a room saying, "Yep, let's build the biggest ship ever." But that's not really how it worked. The Titanic was the result of a partnership between White Star Line, the shipping company that owned the vessel, and Harland and Wolff, the Belfast shipbuilder that actually constructed it. On top of that, White Star Line had already been absorbed into J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Company, which meant the ship existed inside a much bigger world of international finance and shipping consolidation. Bruce Ismay remained chairman of White Star after that acquisition and later also became president of IMM. So if we're being honest, the Titanic came from a machine of rich and powerful men, not one single inventor. Still, if people want a main face attached to it, the name that comes up most is J. Bruce Ismay. And Bruce Ismay didn't just magically get rich enough one day. He was basically born into the shipping elite. That alone already tells you a lot. Because sometimes history gets told like success is always about one genius grinding from nothing. But in cases like this, nah. This was legacy, access, and inherited power working together. And personally, I think that makes the story even more interesting, because it reminds us that some of the biggest achievements in history were built by people who didn't start from zero at all. They started halfway up the mountain. If you really want to understand where Titanic money came from, you have to go back to Thomas Henry Ismay, Bruce Ismay's father. Thomas wasn't the builder of the Titanic itself, but he was the man who built the family position that made Bruce powerful enough to help create it later on. Thomas Henry Ismay owned the White Star Line, and after his death in 1899, Bruce Ismay became chairman. And this part matters a lot, because Bruce didn't invent the family fortune from scratch. He inherited leadership over a major shipping company at a time when ocean travel was one of the most important industries in the world. Today, it's easy to forget how huge shipping was back then. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, ocean liners were everything. They moved immigrants, businessmen, mail, cargo, and the upper class. If you controlled ships, you controlled movement. And if you controlled movement in that era, you controlled money, like serious money. Shipping wasn't just transportation, it was prestige, commerce, empire, and influence all rolled into one. So when Bruce inherited White Star Line, he wasn't stepping into a normal business, he was stepping into a transatlantic power structure. And I think this is where a lot of people misunderstand wealth in history. They picture money as cash sitting in a room somewhere. But wealth like this wasn't just cash. It was ownership, networks, brand reputation, contracts, routes, infrastructure, and access to people with even more money. That's the kind of wealth that builds giants. Not lottery money, empire money. White Star Line wasn't just rich, it was positioned in the perfect industry. Now let's talk about why White Star was able to become so powerful in the first place. The company operated in one of the most profitable and competitive routes in the world, the transatlantic passenger trade. This was the age when Europe and America were deeply connected by business, migration, tourism, and social ambition. Rich passengers wanted luxury, middle-class passengers wanted opportunity, poor passengers wanted a new life. Everybody needed ships. And when there's demand at that level, the companies that dominate the route become monsters. White Star Line became known for comfort and luxury, especially under Bruce Ismay's leadership. That's a big deal because it explains something important about the Titanic. The Titanic was not built only to be big, it was built to represent a certain kind of high-end experience. That's why the ship became legendary. Yes, its size mattered, but the glamour mattered too. The image mattered. The message mattered. It was basically saying, we're not just crossing the Atlantic, we're doing it in style that makes the world stare. And honestly, that mindset feels super modern. Companies still do this right now. Sometimes they don't build the best thing because people truly need it. They build the most impressive looking thing because attention itself has value. And Titanic? Titanic was attention turned into steel. Then came the big money move, JP Morgan. Now here's where the story really levels up. Even though the Ismay family already had shipping wealth, the Titanic became possible on an even bigger scale because White Star Line was pulled into a much larger financial empire. In 1902, Bruce Ismay oversaw White Star Line's acquisition by John Pierpont Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Company, usually called IMM. He stayed on as chairman of White Star and later became president of IMM. And if that doesn't sound dramatic at first, let me put it another way. This is the moment the Titanic story stops being just about a rich shipping family and starts being about Wall Street-level power. JP Morgan wasn't just rich, he was one of the financial titans of his era. So when White Star became part of IMM, the company now sat inside a giant trust structure built to dominate shipping through consolidation. That means the money behind Titanic wasn't simply Bruce Ismay had enough cash in his pocket. No. It was more like Bruce Ismay had access to an industrial and financial system big enough to support a ship like Titanic. That distinction matters. A lot of gigantic projects in history happen because someone owns everything personally. But a lot of them also happen because someone is positioned close enough to capital, investors, and corporate structure that they can make impossible things happen anyway. And to me, that's one of the most fascinating parts of this whole story. Because wealth isn't always about what you personally hold. Sometimes it's about what you can command. Sometimes it's about whose phone call gets answered. Sometimes it's about whether the richest men in the world see your idea as useful to their empire. And Bruce Ismay was absolutely in that world. The Titanic was also born from competition and ego. One of the biggest curiosities in this story is that the Titanic didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of rivalry. In 1907, Bruce Ismay reportedly attended a dinner with William James Peary, the powerful figure behind Harland and Wolff, and the two are widely associated with the plan to create a new class of giant luxury liners to compete with Cunard Line on the transatlantic route. The Olympic was completed first in 1911, followed by the Titanic in 1912. That detail says everything. This wasn't some peaceful little engineering project. This was competition. Cunard was a major rival. And in elite industries, rivalry doesn't just make people improve. It makes them go bigger, louder, and more dramatic. That's how you end up with ships that don't just need to function. They need to dominate headlines. And if I'm being real, I think human ego is all over this part of the story. People love saying giant historical projects are purely noble achievements, but a lot of them are driven by something much messier: pride, fear of losing status. The need to prove your company is the one the world should be talking about. That feels deeply human and kind of dangerous too. Because when business becomes theater, the pressure to impress can start overpowering the pressure to be cautious. That doesn't mean Titanic was built carelessly from the start. But it does mean the ship existed in a culture obsessed with prestige. And prestige can make smart people act weird. So did Bruce Ismay personally pay for the Titanic? Not exactly. This is where we have to be precise. Bruce Ismay is one of the key names in the Titanic story, but he did not simply wake up one day and personally write one giant check from his own bank account like some movie billionaire. The Titanic was a White Star Line ship built by Harland and Wolff, while White Star itself was under the IMM umbrella after the Morgan acquisition. So the better answer is this. Bruce Ismay had the inherited status, executive power, and elite financial backing to help make Titanic happen. That's very different from saying he alone funded the whole thing from private money. And I actually think the truth is more interesting than the myth, because myths simplify history. Reality shows how giant projects are often born through layers of power: family wealth, corporate control, industry partnerships, and investor confidence. That's how something as outrageous as Titanic becomes real, not because one man was rich, but because the system around him was rich enough to dream on a massive scale. And honestly, that should make people think. Because when a whole system gets obsessed with scale and prestige, it can normalize risk in ways that look visionary at first, right up until disaster hits. What made that level of wealth possible in the first place? Let's zoom out for a second. Why were these men so rich anyway? Because they lived in an age of industrial expansion, empire and consolidation, shipping connected continents. Britain was still one of the world's great imperial powers. Trade routes mattered massively. Ocean liners weren't side businesses, they were central infrastructure. And companies like White Star existed at the intersection of commerce and status. That's a huge combo. They made money moving people and goods, but they also made money from reputation. Rich people wanted luxury crossings. Migrants filled lower classes. Mail contracts and cargo mattered too. The entire structure of the era supported giant shipping profits, so when people ask, how did Titanic's creator get that rich? The answer is, he didn't get rich from one lucky moment. He came from a family that was already deeply embedded in one of the most important industries on Earth, then got linked to one of the most powerful financial empires of the age. That's the real answer. It's way less romantic than the self-made genius version, but it's also way more believable. And in my opinion, history gets a lot easier to understand when we stop pretending huge fortunes always come from pure brilliance alone. Sometimes they come from timing, class, inheritance, and access, with intelligence layered on top. That's not me hating, that's just being honest. How many dollars did they spend to build the Titanic? It cost about $7.5 million to build the Titanic back in the early 1910s. In today's money, that would be roughly $200 million to $250 million, depending on how you calculate inflation. Fun fact, one single person didn't just pull that money out of their pocket to build the Titanic. The ship was built by Harland and Wolff in Belfast for the White Star Line, a shipping company that was part of the business empire of the wealthy financier J.P. Morgan. So yeah, the funding came from a big corporate setup, not just one rich guy writing a check. April 14th, 1912, 11:40 p.m. That's the exact moment everything went wrong. I don't know why, but every time I think about it, it hits me different. Like, imagine being there. Cold night, calm ocean, and then boom. Everything changes in seconds. And then 2:20 a.m. April 15th. That's it. Gone. The Titanic, this unsinkable giant, just disappears into the dark. Man, this story messes with me, like deep. All those people, all those dreams, just frozen in time. It's crazy how something that happened over 100 years ago can still feel so real, you know? Sometimes I catch myself just sitting there thinking, what would I have done? And honestly, that thought alone gives me chills every single time. Do you think the Titanic was mainly a symbol of human ambition, or do you see it more as a symbol of human arrogance? Like, if you had to pick just one, which one fits better? Drop it in the comments, ambition or arrogance. And if you want to go deeper, tell me why. Because honestly, those comment sections where people actually debate history are way more fun than the boring first comments everybody forgets in 2 seconds. Also, if you're into stories where history, money, power, and human nature all crash into each other in the craziest ways possible, hit subscribe, because that's exactly the kind of stuff we talk about here. So the next time somebody asks, how did Titanic's founder get so rich? Now you know the deeper answer. It wasn't one man randomly becoming wealthy enough to build the world's most famous ship. It was a chain. Family fortune, shipping dominance, corporate consolidation, JP Morgan-level finance, industrial ambition, and a huge dose of human pride. That's what built the Titanic. And maybe that's why the story still feels so modern, because even now, the world is still full of powerful people building giant things to prove something, to competitors, to the public, maybe even to themselves. And sometimes those projects become legends, sometimes they become warnings, sometimes they become both. And the Titanic, it became both forever. If this video gave you a new perspective, drop a comment with the one sentence that hit you the hardest. And if you want more stories told in a way that actually feels alive, not dry, not robotic, not textbook boring, stay with this channel. Because history gets way more interesting when you stop looking at dates alone and start looking at the people, the ego, the money, and the decisions underneath it all. God bless you. See you in the next video. Bye-bye.